The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the dark windows of the black luxury sedan. The street was silent, save for the low hum of the patrol car's engine and the hurried footsteps of the two police officers marching toward the driver's side. "Step out of the car," one of them barked. The man inside did not move right away. He sat still, his hands gripping the wheel as if expecting this moment but dreading it all the same. "I said, step out," the officer yelled again, this time slamming his flashlight against the tinted window. With a slow, measured breath, the man complied. He unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for the handle, but before he could even open the door fully, he was yanked out. His knees hit the pavement hard, pain shooting up his legs as rough hands forced his arms behind his back. "You think you can just drive around here like you own the place?" the second officer sneered. He was younger, cocky, with a smirk that barely hid the hatred in his eyes. The man didn't struggle. He had seen this happen too many times to others. He had fought cases about it. He had written articles, given speeches, but tonight it was him. One officer patted him down aggressively while the other pressed a knee into his back. "You got drugs in the car?" "No." "You got weapons?" "No." "We'll see about that." The first officer rummaged through his pockets, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open, glancing at the ID, then his face turned white. The younger officer noticed the change. "What's wrong?" The first cop didn't answer right away. His eyes darted from the ID back to the man kneeling on the pavement. His hands trembled slightly as he read the name printed on the card. The man lifted his head, his voice calm but piercing. "My name is Jonathan Cole. I am the chief prosecutor of this state." Silence. The young officer blinked. "What?" The older cop's lips parted slightly, as if trying to form words, but none came out. His partner snatched the wallet from his hands and stared at it. "Chief prosecutor," the very man who had the power to put them behind bars. A muscle twitched in the older officer's jaw. He had spent years profiling, targeting, and arresting men who looked exactly like Jonathan Cole. Never, in his wildest imagination, did he think he'd be kneeling on the pavement with his knee on the back of a man who could end his entire career with a single phone call. Then came the words that made both officers' blood run cold. "You two have no idea what you've just done." Hours earlier, Jonathan had been finishing up late at the office. His desk was cluttered with case files, and the dim lamp beside him cast long shadows on the wall. He rubbed his temples, exhausted. He had spent the last several months prosecuting one of the biggest police corruption cases in the state. Officers who had planted evidence. Officers who had lied on reports. Officers who had taken the lives of innocent men. And now, he was driving home after another long night, unaware that he was about to become the very thing he fought against. Another black man targeted by the very system he worked for. His phone buzzed. It was his assistant, Olivia. "You should head home," she said. "You've done enough for today." "I just have one more file to go through," he muttered, flipping through a report. "Jonathan, it's late. Even prosecutors need sleep." He sighed, finally pushing the papers aside. All right. I'm leaving now." He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, the city lights glowing in the distance. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional car zipping past as he made his way to his black BMW. The air was crisp as he slid into the driver's seat, the leather cool beneath his fingers. He started the engine and pulled onto the road, the city slowly fading behind him as he drove toward his quiet suburban neighborhood. Then, in his rearview mirror, he saw the headlights. At first, he didn't think much of it, but when the car behind him swerved suddenly and sped up, his pulse quickened. And then, the sirens. He glanced at his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a red light. He hadn't done anything wrong. But that didn't matter. His hands tightened on the wheel as he pulled over. The flashing lights illuminated the inside of his car, his heart pounding as he watched the officers step out of their vehicle. He took a deep breath. This wasn't supposed to happen to him. But deep down, he had always known. It didn't matter if he wore a suit or a badge or carried the law in his hands. At the end of the day, to them, he was just another black man behind the wheel. And now they had him on the ground. Back in the present moment, the older officer took a stumbling step back, still gripping Jonathan's wallet as if it had burned him. The younger cop was still kneeling on Jonathan's back. "Get off me," Jonathan said, his voice level but firm. The officer hesitated. "I said, get off me." Slowly, the knee lifted. Jonathan exhaled sharply, pushing himself up with shaking hands. His wrists were still cuffed behind his back. He turned his head, fixing the officers with a stare that cut through the night air. The younger cop finally found his voice. We didn't know." Jonathan let out a bitter chuckle. "You didn't ask." The officers exchanged glances, their faces pale under the glow of the streetlights. Jonathan looked at the cuffs around his wrists. "Take these off." The older cop hesitated, then quickly reached for his keys, fumbling as he unlocked them. The metal clicked, and Jonathan rubbed his sore wrists, the red marks glaring against his dark skin. He rose to his feet, towering over the two men. For the first time, they looked small. Jonathan stepped closer. "Tell me, officers, what exactly was my crime?" Neither of them answered. He nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." He reached for his phone. The officers stiffened. Jonathan smirked. "Oh, don't worry. I'm not reaching for a weapon. That's your game, not mine." He tapped the screen, dialing. The moment the person on the other end answered, he spoke. "This is Jonathan Cole. I need you to send an IA unit to my location immediately." The older officer's breath hitched. Internal affairs. The younger officer's face drained of all color. Jonathan locked eyes with them. "I hope you boys are ready. Because your careers? They end tonight." And just like that, the air shifted. The power had flipped. The officers, once so full of confidence, now looked like men walking toward their own execution. Jonathan had been on this road before. But tonight, for once, he wasn't just another victim. Tonight, justice was coming, and it was wearing his face. The officers stood frozen, their bodies stiff as Jonathan ended the call. His breathing was steady, but his blood boiled beneath his skin. He had spent his entire career fighting against men like them. And now, here they were, caught in the same trap they had set for others. The older officer, whose name tag read Grayson, finally found his voice. "Look, we didn't know who you were." Jonathan let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "Is that supposed to make it better?" The younger officer, Miller, swallowed hard. His hands twitched at his sides, as if resisting the urge to reach for his gun. "Sir, Don't call me sir now," Jonathan interrupted. "Not after you had me face down on the pavement." Miller's jaw clenched. He wanted to fight back, to say something, but there was nothing he could say. Grayson tried again. Maybe we can work something out." Jonathan's head tilted slightly. "Work something out." His voice was quiet, but there was danger in it. "Are you offering me a deal, Officer Grayson?" Grayson stammered. "And no, I just mean..." Jonathan took a slow step forward. The officers flinched. That made him angrier. "You didn't flinch when you slammed me onto the ground," he said coldly. "You didn't hesitate when you accused me of having drugs or weapons. But now that you know I'm the man who can bury you, you're afraid." He let the words sink in. Miller, younger and dumber, still didn't know when to stay quiet. "We were just doing our jobs." Jonathan's nostrils flared. "Your job? Your job is to serve and protect. Tell me, Officer Miller, who was I a threat to tonight?" Miller had no answer. But Jonathan wasn't done. "How many times have you done this?" he asked, voice lower now. "How many black men have you pulled over for no reason? How many did you humiliate or throw in the back of your car, or worse?" Miller's face was red, but he said nothing. Jonathan shook his head. "You thought I was just another one, didn't you? Just another man you could harass without consequences." Grayson wiped a hand over his face. "Look, Prosecutor Cole, maybe we..." Jonathan held up a hand. "Don't say another word." The silence stretched. Then, in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens broke the night. Internal affairs had arrived. Half an hour later, the quiet suburban street had turned into a crime scene. IA officers stood in a circle around the two cops, asking questions. Flashlights cut through the darkness, casting sharp, bouncing shadows. Jonathan stood to the side, watching. He was still rattled, but he refused to show it. He had spent years controlling his emotions, never letting his anger slip through the cracks. But tonight it was different. Tonight, the anger had power. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, and a woman in a sharp gray suit stepped out. Olivia. She spotted him immediately, her heels clicking against the pavement as she marched toward him. "Jonathan," she breathed, scanning his face for injuries. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." She didn't look convinced. "IA called me. I figured." He looked back at the officers, now sitting on the curb, their hands resting on their knees, looking small. "They were ready to arrest me." Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course they were." Jonathan exhaled sharply. "They had me in cuffs, Olivia. They had me on the ground." Her hands curled into fists. "And now?" Jonathan's eyes darkened. "Now, we make sure they never do it to anyone else." She nodded. "You're filing charges?" His jaw tightened. "I'm going to do more than that." Olivia studied him carefully. She had known him for years, had seen him take down the most corrupt men in the city. But there was something different about him tonight. "This isn't just about them," she murmured. "Is it?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. Finally, he turned to her. "It never was." Before she could say anything else, a voice called out, "Mr. Cole." Jonathan turned to see a stern-looking man in a dark suit approaching. "Agent Paulson, head of internal affairs." "We need your statement," Paulson said. Jonathan nodded, but before he followed, he looked back at the two officers one last time. Grayson wouldn't meet his gaze. Miller stared back, something dark flickering behind his eyes. It wasn't regret. It was hate. Jonathan filed that away. He had won the battle, but the war had just begun. Jonathan sat in a sterile, white-walled room inside the Internal Affairs office. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching the moment longer than it needed to be. He had given a statement, told them everything. How he was pulled over without reason, how he was thrown to the ground, cuffed, humiliated. But he could tell. He could see in their faces. The hesitation, the calculation. They weren't looking at this as an open-and-shut case. They were looking for a way to bury it. Agent Paulson sat across from him, hands folded neatly on the table. His expression was unreadable, but Jonathan had been in this business long enough to know when a man was stalling. "So, let me get this straight," Paulson said, tapping his pen against the table. "Officers Grayson and Miller pulled you over, forcibly removed you from the vehicle, and placed you in handcuffs without ever giving you a valid reason for the stop?" Jonathan leaned forward. "That's exactly what happened." Paulson nodded slowly. "And you want formal charges filed against them?" Jonathan's jaw clenched. "I don't want formal charges. I expect them." Paulson exhaled through his nose. "Prosecutor Cole, I hope you understand the gravity of this situation." "Oh, I do." Jonathan folded his arms. "Do you?" Paulson hesitated, then leaned back. "I know the department is under a lot of scrutiny right now. And with the corruption case you've been working on, tensions are already high." Jonathan knew where this was going. "You're telling me this isn't a good time to go after dirty cops?" he asked, voice ice cold. Paulson gave him a long look. "I'm telling you that this case is complicated." Jonathan let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "It's only complicated because I have power. If I were just another black man on the street, this wouldn't even be a conversation." Paulson didn't argue. Jonathan leaned forward. "Let me make something clear. If you don't file charges, I will." Paulson studied him for a long moment. "You're serious about this?" "As serious as the gun they would have pulled if I'd moved too fast." Paulson sighed and rubbed his temples. "I'll review everything. But just know, this isn't going to be easy." Jonathan stood. "Nothing ever is." And with that, he walked out. The night air was cool when Jonathan stepped outside. Olivia was waiting by his car, her arms crossed, impatience written all over her face. "Well," she asked. Jonathan exhaled. "They're dragging their feet." "Of course they are," Olivia muttered. "They don't want the heat." Jonathan unlocked his car, but he didn't get in. He stood there for a moment, gripping the handle, his mind racing. "Jonathan," Olivia said softly. He looked at her. "You okay?" No, he wasn't okay. He had spent his entire life believing that if he worked hard, if he played by the rules, if he became the system, then maybe, just maybe, he could escape it. But tonight had proven otherwise. He wasn't Jonathan Cole, chief prosecutor. He was just another black man in a car. "I will be," he finally said, but even he didn't believe it. Across town, in a dimly lit bar, officers Grayson and Miller sat in a secluded booth, nursing their drinks. Grayson looked exhausted, rubbing his face with both hands. Miller, on the other hand, was tense, his grip on his glass tight enough to shatter it. "This is bad," Grayson muttered. "No kidding," Miller snapped. "We arrested the chief prosecutor." "Do you know what that means?" Grayson shot him a look. "I was there, Miller." Miller's knee bounced under the table. "They're going to come after us." Grayson let out a breath. "We made a mistake." Miller slammed his glass down. "Stop saying that. We didn't make a mistake. We did what we always do." Grayson didn't say anything, because that was the problem. They had done what they always did, and now, for the first time, it had consequences. Miller's eyes darkened. "You really think he's going to let this go?" Grayson swallowed. "No." Miller leaned in. "Then we've got a problem." Grayson sighed. "Maybe we just—" "I'm not losing my job over this," Miller interrupted. "We have to do something." Grayson looked at him warily. "What are you suggesting?" Miller's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smirk. "I think it's time we reminded Cole who really runs this city." Grayson's stomach twisted. "Miller!" Miller took a sip of his drink, eyes gleaming. "This isn't over." Jonathan sat in his dimly lit study, staring at the half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. His body was still tense from the events of the night, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had spent years bringing corrupt officers to justice. He had seen the depths of their cruelty, the way they operated in the shadows, covering for each other like a brotherhood built on fear and silence. But tonight was different. Tonight, he hadn't been standing behind a courtroom podium, arguing for justice. Tonight, he had been on the pavement, wrists cuffed, his body pinned under the weight of men who saw him as nothing more than a suspect. And it infuriated him. His phone buzzed on a desk. He picked it up and saw Olivia's name. "Talk to me," he said. "You were right." Olivia's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "IA is dragging this out. Paulson just put both officers on paid leave." "That's it." Jonathan's grip tightened around his glass. "Paid leave. They're not suspending them. They're investigating." Jonathan let out a slow breath, trying to steady his growing anger. "They're hoping this blows over." "Exactly." Olivia hesitated. "We need to move on this fast, Jonathan. If they sweep it under the rug." "They won't." His voice was firm. "Not this time." A pause. Then, Olivia's voice softened. "Are you okay?" Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment. Was he okay? The image of Miller's smirk flashed in his mind. The weight of Grayson's knee against his back. The cold steel of the cuffs. No, he wasn't okay. But he didn't have time to not be okay. "I'll be fine," he said finally. "First thing in the morning, we're filing an official complaint. And then, I'm going to make sure these officers never wear a badge again." Olivia exhaled. "Good." Jonathan set his glass down. "And Olivia?" "Yeah. Be careful. I have a bad feeling about this." She was silent for a second. Then, she said, "You too." Jonathan hung up and leaned back in his chair. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Meanwhile, in a dark alley behind a run-down strip of bars, Miller leaned against the hood of his patrol car, puffing on a cigarette. Grayson stood beside him, arms crossed, his face lined with worry. "You need to let this go," Grayson muttered. Miller exhaled a thick cloud of smoke. "Not a chance." Grayson shook his head. "You don't get it, do you? This guy is powerful. He could have us both in cuffs by next week." Miller smirked. "Not if we get to him first." Grayson's blood went cold. "What the hell does that mean?" Miller flicked his cigarette away. "Cole thinks he can come after us. He thinks he's different from the rest of them." Grayson's jaw tightened. "You want to scare him? Fine. But if you're thinking about doing something stupid..." Miller clapped a hand on Grayson's shoulder. "Relax. I just want to remind him who's in control." Grayson swallowed. He had seen Miller go too far before. But this was a dangerous game. Still, he said nothing as Miller climbed into his car and drove off. And deep down, he knew this wasn't going to end well. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at his office earlier than usual. The city was still waking up, the streets bathed in the soft glow of sunrise. He sipped his coffee, mentally preparing for the day ahead. But as he stepped out of his car, something made him stop. His office door was slightly open. Jonathan frowned. He was always the first one in. No one should be here. Slowly, he pushed the door open. His office was trashed. Files were thrown across the floor. Papers scattered. His desk overturned. The framed photos on the walls had been ripped down, glass shattered across the carpet. And then his stomach twisted, because right in the center of the mess, pinned to his wall with a knife, was a single piece of paper. A message. Drop the charges. Jonathan stared at the words, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. And for the first time in his career, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not outrage, something colder, something more dangerous. He wasn't just fighting a case anymore. This was personal, and whoever had done this, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Jonathan stood frozen in his office, staring at the paper with a threatening message pinned to the wall. His pulse quickened as the reality of what this meant started to sink in. This wasn't just an empty threat. It was a warning, a direct challenge. He took a step closer to the wall, his eyes narrowing. The handwriting was messy, jagged, aggressive. There was no doubt in his mind now. Someone, somewhere in this city, had decided that he needed to be silenced. But why? Because of the officers? Or something more? The knife that had been used to pin the note to the wall was a symbol of intimidation, of power. And Jonathan knew exactly what that meant. This wasn't some random act of vandalism. This was a message from someone who wanted him out of the way. He stepped back, his hands clenching into fists. And then, as his mind raced through the possibilities, he heard the sharp sound of footsteps behind him. Jonathan. Olivia's voice was strained, her eyes wide with concern as she stepped into the room. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He was still looking at the note, his mind spinning. "Jonathan," she repeated, this time her voice more insistent. He turned slowly, his face hard. "They're coming after me," he said quietly. Olivia's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" He nodded toward the note. "This is their warning." Olivia's gaze followed his. When she saw the message, her face drained of color. "This is bad," she murmured. "This is really bad." Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to call a meeting with the mayor. We need to move fast." "Jonathan." Olivia's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're already trying to intimidate you. This isn't just about those two officers anymore." He looked at her, eyes steely. "I know that, but we don't have a choice. The longer I wait, the more people like them will think they can do whatever they want." Olivia shook her head, her eyes worried. "This isn't just about corrupt cops anymore, Jonathan. Whoever did this," she trailed off, knowing exactly what it meant. "They have power. They know who you are, and they're sending a message." Jonathan didn't respond right away. He stared at the knife embedded in the wall, as if it could tell him who was behind it. His hand twitched, but he stayed still, trying to ignore the surge of adrenaline coursing through his body. "Whoever did this isn't just trying to silence me," he said finally, his voice colder now. "They're trying to make an example of me." Olivia swallowed. "We need to be careful." "I know," Jonathan said, turning toward his desk and grabbing his phone. "I've dealt with—" At the same time, just a few miles away, Officer Miller was standing in front of a large mirror, adjusting his uniform. He had been up all night, planning his next move, his thoughts racing. He had made a dangerous decision the night before, but now, as he looked at himself in the mirror, he was beginning to doubt. He had never been this deep before, never played a game this risky. But the thought of Jonathan Cole standing above him, in the light of his own righteousness, was something Miller couldn't stomach. He wasn't just a cop. He wasn't just a cog in the wheel of the system. He was someone who deserved respect. And if anyone was going to take down the prosecutor, it would be him. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Something wasn't right. Miller's phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "You made your move. Be ready for the consequences." The words sent a chill down his spine. Who was it from? He didn't recognize the number. But the message, it was clear. Someone else knew what he was up to. The problem was, Miller didn't know who he was dealing with. But he had a feeling the consequences were coming, and they wouldn't be easy to face. Back at Jonathan's office, his mind was racing. He had just finished speaking with the mayor and had laid out the facts. The officers involved were corrupt, and now someone was sending threats. He needed more support, and fast. He needed the mayor to stand behind him, or else this was all going to collapse. The mayor, however, wasn't as enthusiastic. "I understand the urgency, Jonathan," the mayor said, his voice strained over the phone. "But this situation, it's complicated. You're talking about more than just two bad cops here. You're talking about the entire system." "I don't care about the system anymore," Jonathan snapped. "I care about justice." The mayor sighed. "You're not thinking clearly. You're letting your emotions get the best of you." "I'm thinking just fine," Jonathan retorted. "I've spent my whole career taking down the people you've been too afraid to go after. Now, when it's my turn, you want me to sit back and let it happen?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jonathan," the mayor's voice softened, "if you continue down this path, you'll lose everything. Your career, your life." Jonathan's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm already losing it." He slammed the phone down, his heart hammering in his chest. The mayor was right about one thing. This was bigger than just a few bad cops. This was about power, and power didn't like to be challenged. Jonathan stood up, pacing the floor. He had to keep moving. He couldn't let them win. The door to his office creaked open. Olivia walked in, her face pale. "Jonathan, I think we need to talk." Jonathan stopped pacing. "What's wrong?" Olivia's eyes flicked to the floor, avoiding his gaze. "I just heard from someone inside IA. There's talk about you. Not just as a prosecutor, but as a target." Jonathan froze. "What are you saying?" "They're saying it's not just the cops you need to worry about," she whispered. "They're talking about the people who protect them." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as Olivia's words echoed in his mind. The people who protect them. For the first time in a long while, doubt crept into his chest. He had always been certain of one thing. If he fought hard enough, if he stayed true to his convictions, then justice would prevail. But now, he wasn't sure anymore. This wasn't just about corrupt cops who had lost their way. This was about something far bigger. Something that stretched beyond the police force, beyond the city's walls. "Who exactly are we talking about, Olivia?" Jonathan's voice was low, controlled, but there was a sharp edge to it that made her hesitate. "I don't know yet," Olivia replied, her hands clenched tightly in front of her. "But I heard whispers. People in IA, people who work in higher offices, they're talking about making an example of you." Jonathan let out a bitter laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "So it's not just the cops now. It's the system. The entire damn system." Olivia nodded grimly. "Yes." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the situation pressed on him. If they could silence him, if they could stop him from bringing those officers down, then what hope did anyone have? He had seen how corrupt the system was from the inside out, but this felt like something even more insidious. "What do we do now?" Olivia's voice broke through his thoughts. Jonathan's eyes darkened. "We keep going." She raised an eyebrow. "You're not scared?" Jonathan shook his head, the fire returning to his eyes. "I've been fighting this fight my whole career, Olivia. It's bigger than me, and it's bigger than anything they can throw at me. I'll fight until my last breath." Olivia stared at him, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She could see the determination in his eyes, but she also saw something else, the fear. It was hidden beneath the surface, but it was there, just like a shadow creeping in the dark. And she couldn't ignore it. "You sure about this?" Olivia asked quietly. Jonathan nodded firmly. "I'm sure." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and planning. Jonathan couldn't afford to wait around anymore. Every minute counted. He needed to file the official complaints, gather evidence, and meet with key allies in the press. There was no time to lose. But as the day dragged on, things began to feel off. Something wasn't right. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He tried to push it aside, to focus on the task at hand, but it lingered like a ghost at the edge of his mind. It wasn't until he was heading home later that evening, the sun setting behind him as he drove through the empty streets, that he finally realized what it was. His rearview mirror reflected a set of headlights following closely behind him. At first, he thought it was just another car, but the car kept following him, no matter how many turns he made. Jonathan's heart began to race. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and his thoughts spiraled. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. Was it the police? A colleague? Or worse, someone else? He pulled onto a quieter road, hoping to lose the tail. But the car behind him stayed right there, like a shadow he couldn't escape. He glanced at his phone, weighing whether or not to call Olivia. But if it was them, if it was someone trying to intimidate him, he didn't want to lure anyone yet. He pushed his foot down on the gas pedal, trying to outrun the car, but the headlights stayed locked on him. Finally, his anxiety turned to action. He took a sharp turn onto a side street, swerving through narrow alleyways. His heart was pounding, and sweat began to form on his brow as he realized the car wasn't giving up. Then, just as Jonathan was about to make another turn, the headlights behind him flashed brightly. For a moment, it was blinding, and Jonathan slammed on the brakes hard in his throat. The flash of light was so intense that he couldn't see a thing. But as he turned his head to the side, trying to shield his eyes, he saw something move out of the corner of his vision. A shadow, then a loud bang. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the empty street. His blood went cold. "Shit," Jonathan cursed, slamming his foot on the accelerator. His car lurched forward, tires screeching as he desperately tried to outrun whoever was after him. The car behind him sped up too. No hesitation, no mercy. Jonathan could hear the engine roaring behind him, gaining on him with every second. He could see his life flashing before his eyes, the city slipping by too fast for him to make sense of. Another shot rang out, this time much closer. Jonathan swerved to the side, narrowly missing a parked car as the bullet shattered his rearview mirror. His hands were shaking, but he kept his focus, not daring to look behind him. But then, as he turned a sharp corner, he heard the screeching of tires. The car following him slammed into his bumper, sending Jonathan's car spinning out of control. The world around him spun, and for a terrifying moment, Jonathan thought his car was going to flip. But somehow he managed to regain control, slamming the wheel hard to the right, forcing the car back onto the road. His heart was pounding in his chest, his breathing ragged. But the car behind him didn't give up. They were getting closer. Jonathan's mind raced, but there was no escape. He had reached a dead-end street, with nowhere left to go. This was it. The headlights blazed in his rearview mirror, the engine roaring closer with every heartbeat. Suddenly, the car behind him pulled up alongside him, and for the first time, Jonathan saw the faces of the people who were chasing him. There were two men inside, both wearing masks, both with guns raised. They were coming for him. But before he could react, the car's door flew open, and the passenger stepped out. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, and their movements were swift, predatory. Jonathan didn't have time to think. He pulled his own gun from the glove compartment and pointed it at the man, his heart racing. He had no choice. He had to fight back. The man smiled. Then the world went black. Jonathan's body jerked violently as the blackness swallowed him whole. The last thing he remembered was the cold, metallic click of the gun's safety being switched off. Then, everything went dark. His head throbbed, and his limbs felt heavy. Slowly, groggily, Jonathan became aware of his surroundings. He was no longer in his car. The smooth leather of his seat was replaced by the rough, hard surface of what felt like metal. His wrists were shackled to a chair. His legs felt numb, but he could still feel the cold air around him. It took him a moment to adjust his blurry vision, but when he did, the sharp sting of fear hit him like a punch to the gut. He was in a dimly lit room. The walls were concrete, rough and unforgiving. He could barely make out the shadows of figures around him. Two men standing against the far wall, their expressions unreadable. His mind was racing, but the pounding in his skull made it difficult to focus. He tried to move his arms, but the chains around his wrists pulled tight. "Ah, you're awake," a voice said, smooth and almost mocking. Jonathan's eyes snapped toward the sound. Standing in front of him was a man he didn't recognize, a tall, clean-shaven figure in a dark suit. His posture was confident, relaxed, like he wasn't even fazed by the situation at hand. "You," Jonathan croaked, his voice hoarse. "Who are you?" The man smiled, his eyes narrowing. "You don't need to know who I am, Mr. Cole." "Not yet." Jonathan tried to focus, but his mind felt foggy, like someone had stuffed cotton inside his head. He gritted his teeth, pushing through the disorientation. He couldn't afford to be weak, not now. "What do you want from me?" Jonathan demanded. The man took a step forward. What do I want? How about I start with respect? You see, for a long time, men like you have been walking around thinking they could change things, but they could just take down people like me. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Who are you? The man chuckled, clearly enjoying the moment. Like I said, you don't need to know who I am. You're here because you've gotten too big for your own good. You think you can just waltz into our world and start making noise? Start breaking down the system? Jonathan's heart was pounding. I'm not breaking anything. I'm exposing corruption. You're nothing. The man's voice was suddenly cold. You're an ant, Mr. Cole. And ants can be crushed. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as the man took another step forward. The two figures standing against the wall didn't move, their presence menacing, unmoving. Jonathan didn't flinch. He had faced worse than this. He'd fought men in power before. But this felt different. The confidence radiating off this man wasn't just a product of arrogance. It was the confidence of someone who had the ability to back up their threats. The man reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small, silver pocket watch. He turned it over in his hands, studying it with almost reverent attention. Then, he looked back at Jonathan. I gave you a chance, Mr. Cole. I really did, the man said, his voice almost too calm. But now you've forced my hand. You've made things personal. Jonathan's eyes locked onto his. You think I'm scared of you? You're wrong. You're dead wrong. The man smiled, and for the first time, Jonathan noticed the faint trace of amusement in his eyes. You're in no position to be making threats. You're going to do exactly what we want, or we'll make sure that everything you've ever worked for, everything you hold dear, is destroyed. Jonathan clenched his jaw. I won't let you get away with this. I'll fight you until my last breath. The man's expression hardened. You don't have a choice, Cole. You've already lost. Just then, the door to the room creaked open, and another figure stepped inside. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat when he recognized the person who walked through the door. It was Miller, the same officer who had harassed him the night before. Jonathan's stomach churned with disgust. He spat. You're working with him? Miller didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the man in the suit, his face tight with unease. Then he stepped forward. Look, Jonathan, this is the way it has to be. Miller stopped as the man in the suit raised a hand. No more talking, the man said coldly. Miller, you know what to do. Miller hesitated for a moment before walking toward Jonathan. Jonathan's eyes flicked back and forth between Miller and the man in the suit. But before anything could happen, the door burst open again, and Olivia stormed into the room, her expression fierce. Miller, she shouted, you don't get to do this. Miller froze, his eyes flicking toward her. His posture stiffened. Olivia, you don't want to be here. Go home. This is bigger than you. Olivia didn't budge. Not this time. You've gone too far. The man in the suit's eyes narrowed. She's not supposed to be here. I don't care. Olivia shot back. You're not taking Jonathan down, and you're not going to get away with this. Jonathan's heart surged with a new hope, but it was short-lived as the man in the suit snapped his fingers. In an instant, the two figures who had been lurking in the shadows lunged forward, restraining Olivia before she could react. Get off her, Jonathan shouted, trying to break free from his restraints. But it was useless. His chains were too tight. Olivia struggled, but the men held her down with terrifying force. Jonathan, you need to listen to me, she yelled. You're in danger. Before she could finish, the man in the suit turned to Miller. Take care of them both. Jonathan's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was an execution. Miller raised his gun, aiming it at Jonathan. His hands were shaking, but his finger was on the trigger. Don't do this, Jonathan said, his voice low and steady. Miller hesitated. The gun trembled in his hands, and for a moment, Jonathan saw something flicker in his eyes. Was it doubt? But before Miller could respond, the man in the suit took a step forward, his voice cold and final. Pull the trigger, Miller. Miller's face twisted with frustration, but he didn't move. A long, tense silence stretched out. Then the man in the suit smirked, stepping back. You're both lucky. For now. He turned to Miller. Take them to the other room. We'll deal with them later. The weight of the moment was unbearable. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as he was roughly pulled from his chair, the cold metal chains still around his wrists. Olivia was dragged behind him, her resistance futile. As they were led out of the room, Jonathan knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The cold metal door clanged shut behind Jonathan and Olivia. They were shoved into a small, dimly lit room, their hands still shackled to chairs, the silence in the room oppressive. Jonathan's mind raced, but there was no time to panic. He needed to think. His chest still throbbed from the tension in the previous moments. The gun, Miller's hesitation, the sickening feeling in the pit of his stomach. It was all too much. But he couldn't let fear control him. Not now. Olivia, who had been quiet ever since they were thrown in the room, shifted in her seat. Her eyes were wide, but there was a resolve in them. She wasn't about to break. Neither was Jonathan. "We'll get out of here," Jonathan said, his voice firm. He wasn't asking. He was stating a fact. Olivia gave a slight nod, but didn't respond. She wasn't sure how they were going to get out of this, but she trusted Jonathan. She had seen him fight before, and she knew he wouldn't give up. But as the minutes ticked by, doubts started creeping in. There had to be something they could do. The chains, the locked door, the guards. Everything about this place screamed hopeless. But Jonathan didn't give up, and neither did she. "We need to think," Jonathan muttered. Olivia turned to him. "You think they'll kill us?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Not yet. They want something from me, from both of us. I don't think they'll pull the trigger unless they absolutely have to." "But what do they want?" Olivia asked. Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. "I don't know yet, but I've been in enough situations like this to know when they're stalling. They want leverage. They want us to beg, to cave under pressure. But that's not going to happen. We can't give them what they want." "Right." Olivia's eyes met his, and there was a flicker of something. Fear, but also determination. "So what do we do now?" Jonathan scanned the room, looking for anything that could help them. The walls were concrete, no windows, just a single rusted door. There was nothing in the room except for the two of them and the chairs they were shackled to. But then something caught his eye. At the far corner of the room, there was a small ventilation grate. It wasn't big, but it was big enough for someone to crawl through. Jonathan's eyes lit up. "Olivia, look." She followed his gaze. "The ventilation system?" He nodded. "If we can get that grate off, we might be able to crawl through and get out." Olivia studied the grate for a moment, her face thoughtful. "It's small, but we could make it work. The problem is, how do we get to it?" Jonathan's hands were still shackled behind him, but he wasn't about to let that stop him. He leaned forward in his chair, testing the restraints. The chains bit into his wrists, but they weren't unbreakable. They were just a tool, a barrier. He could work around that. "Can you reach the grate?" Jonathan asked. Olivia strained against her own chains. "I think so, but we'll need to make some noise to get someone's attention. Otherwise, we'll just be stuck here, waiting for them to come back and finish what they started." Jonathan's eyes flicked toward the door. "I don't know how long we have before they come back. We'll have to risk it." Olivia nodded. "I'll try. Just stay quiet. Let me do the talking." Jonathan gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to jump into action himself. He knew Olivia was right. They had to stay calm, stay smart. The minutes passed like hours. Olivia twisted in her chair, testing the strength of the chains. She could feel the slight give, the way the metal links moved under pressure. It wasn't a lot of give, but it was enough. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," Olivia said quietly, her voice firm. "I'll keep trying to reach the grate, and you make noise. Knock against the wall. Bang your chair. Anything that'll get their attention." Jonathan nodded, setting his jaw. "Right, I'll give it a shot." He began to pound his chair against the floor, the sharp sound reverberating in the silence. The noise was deafening, echoing through the room and down the hallway outside. At first, there was no response. But Jonathan kept at it, hitting the floor with as much force as he could muster, hoping to shake the walls loose. Minutes passed. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and his muscles screamed with the effort, but he didn't stop. Then, finally, there was a sound, a footstep, then another. The door creaked open, and the shadow of a figure appeared in the doorway. Jonathan froze, his heart racing. The door swung wide, revealing a guard in a black uniform, his face hard, but his eyes betraying a hint of uncertainty. "What's going on in here?" the guard demanded, his voice deep, gruff. Jonathan kept his gaze steady, tried to control the panic creeping in his chest. "I'm just trying to get out of here," he said, his voice calm, collected. "We're not going to be quiet until you give us a real answer." The guard scowled, his hand twitching toward his sidearm. But Jonathan didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward in his chair, pulling on the restraints just enough to show the man that he wasn't giving up. "What's your plan?" Jonathan pressed. "You just want to keep us locked up here? You don't think we've got friends out there, people who care about us?" The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking between Jonathan and Olivia. She didn't move, just kept her eyes locked on him, steady and defiant. "You've made a mistake, buddy," Jonathan continued. "This isn't going to end well for you." For a moment, it seemed like the guard was about to speak. But instead, he slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. Jonathan's heart sank. "That didn't work," Olivia said softly. Jonathan gritted his teeth. "We're not done yet. I won't give up. Not now." They had to find another way. But for the first time, Jonathan felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were being watched. Every move they made was being tracked, and they were running out of time. And yet, he wasn't ready to break. He couldn't. Not when the stakes were this high. The cold, empty room seemed to press in on Jonathan from all sides. He sat in silence, his hands still chained to the chair. The weight of their situation, the failed attempt to draw attention, the frustrated silence that followed, it was all building up. Yet, despite everything, there was something inside him that refused to accept defeat. Olivia shifted uncomfortably in her own chair. She was silent for a long time, but Jonathan could sense her growing frustration. She was a fighter. He knew that. She was just as determined as he was, but this situation was beginning to feel like one they couldn't escape from. He had spent years prosecuting criminals, bringing down corrupt officials, risking his career and his life for justice. But now he was the one in the chair, the one shackled and helpless. No, he couldn't let it end this way. "We need to keep trying," Jonathan said finally, his voice low but full of conviction. "We can't give up." Olivia nodded, though her eyes betrayed a weariness that Jonathan could see all too clearly. "I don't want to give up, but they're not going to make this easy for us." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "Then we make it hard for them." He scanned the room again, looking for anything that could be used to their advantage. The small ventilation grate still caught his eye, but it seemed impossible to reach. There had to be another way. He wasn't about to sit here and wait for them to decide when his life was over. The sound of footsteps echoed outside the door again, but this time they were slower, deliberate. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. The door opened with a creak, and another man stepped inside. This one was different. He was taller, wearing a black suit with a white shirt. His expression was cold, but his eyes didn't hold the same immediate hostility as the other guards. "Jonathan Cole," the man said, his voice surprisingly calm. "I presume you already know why you're here." Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "I know exactly why I'm here. You're trying to break me." The man smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "You think we're trying to break you, Mr. Cole?" "No, we're trying to make you understand your place in all this." Olivia shifted, her eyes darting between Jonathan and the stranger. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice cautious but defiant. The man ignored her, his attention solely on Jonathan. "You've been a thorn in the side of a lot of powerful people for a long time. You thought you could just walk in here, start exposing everyone's dirty secrets, and face no consequences." Jonathan stared back at him. "The truth always comes with a price. But people like you," he spat, his voice hard and unforgiving. "You're the ones who should be afraid. Not me." The man's lips twitched upward, though it wasn't quite a smile. "I'm not afraid, Mr. Cole. But it seems you're misunderstanding the situation. You're not going to get out of here by fighting. You're going to get out of here by cooperating." Jonathan's heart pounded. "Cooperate?" He laughed bitterly. "With you? What do you think I'm going to do? Bow to you, just because you've got a gun and some fancy suits?" The man took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You misunderstand. It's not a matter of what you do. It's a matter of when you do it. Because, Mr. Cole, you're going to make a choice. And if you don't make the right choice..." His words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Jonathan could feel the pressure mounting. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice. But now, in the face of this uncertainty, he felt small. Alone. But that wasn't true. He wasn't alone. Olivia was still there. And as long as they had each other, they could figure this out. "Tell me what you want," Jonathan said, his voice steady now. "Let's get this over with." The man studied him carefully. "It's simple. You stop your investigation. You walk away from all of this. You let us do what we need to do to keep the city in control. In exchange, we'll let you and your friend go." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "And if I refuse?" The man shrugged. "If you refuse, well, that will be a very different conversation. I'm sure we can make you understand. But I would advise against it. This is your last chance." The silence in the room was deafening. Jonathan could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the man's words hanging over him. He wasn't afraid, not really. But the pressure was mounting, and the reality of their situation was becoming clearer with every passing second. He had been cornered. The fight had never felt this heavy. The choices before him were like two jagged rocks, each more dangerous than the last. Olivia's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but firm. "Jonathan, you don't have to do this. We can find another way." Jonathan looked at her, and for a brief moment, he saw the same fear in her eyes that he had felt earlier. But there was something else there too, something he hadn't seen before. Hope. He couldn't disappoint her. Not now. The man in the suit stepped back, as if giving Jonathan space to make his decision. "I'll give you time to think about it. But remember, Mr. Cole, every second you waste could be the last one you have." With that, he turned on his heel and left the room, the door shutting behind him with a resounding click. Jonathan slumped slightly in his chair, the weight of the decision pressing on him. Olivia stayed silent, watching him carefully. "I don't know what to do," Jonathan murmured after a long pause. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her voice low. "You do know, Jonathan. You've always known. You're not the kind of man who lets them win." Jonathan's gaze hardened, his mind made up. "I'll never give in to them. Never." The door swung open again, but this time, Jonathan wasn't thinking about the man in the suit. He was thinking about the plan. He was thinking about how to fight back. He wasn't done yet, and he wasn't going to let anyone take him down without a fight. The hours dragged on in that cold, oppressive room. Jonathan sat quietly, his mind working overtime as he tried to figure out what to do next. The man in the suit had given him a clear ultimatum: cooperate, or face whatever consequences they had in store. But Jonathan wasn't the kind of man to simply give up, especially not when so much was at stake. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the truth, for justice, for everyone who had ever been silenced by men like them. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on him like 1,000 tons, but it only fueled his resolve. Olivia hadn't spoken much since the man in the suit left, but Jonathan could feel her eyes on him, watching him carefully. He knew she was worried, but he couldn't let her see his doubt. Not now. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway again, and this time, Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just another guard. Something felt different. The footsteps were deliberate, almost as if whoever was approaching had a purpose. The door to the room swung open, and in walked Miller. Jonathan's pulse surged, his anger flaring up at the sight of the officer. The man who had been part of the team that had dragged him out of his car and thrown him onto the pavement, now standing in front of him as if nothing had happened. Miller looked at Jonathan, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and something else, something Jonathan couldn't quite place. For a moment, it felt like the room itself held its breath. Jonathan locked eyes with Miller, refusing to be the first one to look away. "I don't know how you can live with yourself, Miller," Jonathan said, his voice hard and unflinching. "After everything you've done." Miller didn't respond immediately. His hands were twitching at his sides, and his eyes darted to the door as if he was looking for a way out. "You think you can just walk in here and pretend nothing happened?" Jonathan continued. "You've been part of a system that's broken, and He cut himself off, feeling the words like daggers in his chest. "You know better than the men you protect." Miller shifted uncomfortably, his eyes lowering to the ground. It wasn't guilt Jonathan saw, though. It was fear. Fear of being caught. Fear of the consequences that would come if everything Jonathan had uncovered came to light. "I didn't want this," Miller muttered. "I didn't." He stopped, his voice barely a whisper. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. "You didn't want this? Well, here we are, Miller. You and me. And you've got a choice to make. You can stand by the men who put us here, or you can do something right for once in your life." Miller's gaze flickered up, meeting Jonathan's. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I didn't have a choice," Miller said quietly. "I was just following orders. I thought I was doing what was right." His voice broke on the last words, and for the first time, Jonathan saw a crack in his armor. "You know what you've been doing isn't right, Miller," Jonathan said, his voice softening just a fraction. "You've seen it, haven't you? The corruption, the lies. You've been part of it. But you don't have to keep going down this road." Miller stepped back, his face pale. I can't change anything. They're too powerful. You don't understand." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "I understand more than you think. I've spent years fighting men like them. It's always the same. They threaten, they intimidate, and they silence anyone who gets in their way. But what you don't get is that you can change it. You just have to make a choice." For a long moment, Miller didn't say anything. The tension in the room thickened, and Jonathan could feel it like a pressure building up inside him. And then, without warning, Miller moved toward him, his face pale, his eyes flickering with something Jonathan couldn't quite read. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a key. The sound of it rattling in his hand seemed to echo in the room. "What's this?" Jonathan asked, his voice low. Miller didn't answer at first. He stood there for a moment, staring at Jonathan as if weighing the decision in his mind. Then, with a sigh, he moved forward and unlocked the chains that bound Jonathan's wrists. Jonathan felt a rush of freedom, the momentary relief, but it didn't last long. He looked up at Miller, still trying to understand what had just happened. "Why?" Jonathan asked. Miller swallowed hard. Because maybe you're right. Maybe I've been part of something that I don't want to be anymore." Jonathan blinked, trying to process the change in the officer's demeanor. "You letting me go?" Miller nodded, his face conflicted. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but if you want to stop them, you have to get out of here. You can't fight them from in here." Jonathan didn't know whether to trust Miller or not. He wasn't sure if this was some kind of trap, if Miller was playing some game by time. But in his gut, Jonathan felt the pull of hope. "What's your plan?" Jonathan asked. Miller looked at the door nervously. "I'm going to get you out, but we have to hurry. I can't keep them from noticing for long." Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing mind. "All right, but if this is a trick, you won't make it out of here alive." Miller didn't flinch. "I know what I'm doing. I'm just giving you the chance you need." Olivia was still sitting in the chair, watching the exchange carefully. She didn't speak, but Jonathan could see the hope flicker in her eyes, too. Miller quickly moved to the door, looking over his shoulder one last time before pulling it open. The hallway outside was empty, but they couldn't afford to waste any time. "Come on," Miller whispered urgently. Jonathan followed, his body tense with anticipation. This was it, their chance. But the moment they stepped into the hallway, Jonathan's mind screamed at him to be cautious. He had no illusions. They were far from free. But at least for now, they had a shot. The footsteps echoed louder as they moved quickly down the corridor. Jonathan could feel the sweat on the back of his neck as they neared the exit. But just as they were about to round the corner, the sound of voices stopped them dead in their tracks. Jonathan froze, holding his breath. They weren't alone anymore. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as the sound of approaching voices filled the narrow hallway. His body tensed, muscles coiled like a spring, ready to react. Olivia stood close behind him, her breath uneven, but her focus sharp. Miller's hand twitched toward his gun, but Jonathan grabbed his wrist before he could draw it. "No," he whispered. "If we shoot our way out, we won't make it. We need to be smart." Miller hesitated, but nodded, reluctantly lowering his hand. The voices were getting closer. Jonathan's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route. The hallway was too open. If they were spotted, there was no way out except through sheer force. Then he saw it, a supply closet, slightly ajar. He gestured to Olivia and Miller, then moved swiftly, pulling them inside just as two armed guards rounded the corner. The door clicked shut, and the three of them stood in silence, barely breathing. Through the narrow gap in the door, Jonathan could see the guards pause just a few feet away. "You sure you heard something?" one of them asked. "Yeah," the other grumbled. "Boss said to check everything. Cole's a slippery one. If he gets out, it's our asses." Jonathan clenched his jaw, his pulse thundering in his ears. The guards lingered for a moment, scanning the area, their hands hovering near their holsters. Jonathan willed them to move. "Go! Go!" Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first guard muttered, "Nothing here. Let's check the west wing." Their footsteps faded down the hall. Jonathan let out a slow breath, then turned to Miller. "That was too close." Miller nodded, swallowing hard. "We have to keep moving." Jonathan peered out into the hallway. "Clear for now." He stepped out first, motioning for Olivia and Miller to follow. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, slipping past doorways and security cameras. Jonathan didn't know how much time they had before their escape was discovered, but he knew one thing. They had to get out now. Miller led them down a back corridor, whispering, "There's an emergency exit at the end of this hallway. It leads to the service tunnels. If we can get there, we can slip out without setting off alarms." Jonathan nodded, but he didn't let his guard down. He didn't trust Miller completely. Not yet. They crept forward, careful to avoid making any noise. Then, a sudden beep echoed through the hall. Jonathan froze. The overhead lights turned red. A deep, mechanical voice boomed over the intercom. "Security breach detected. All units to lockdown positions." Jonathan's stomach dropped. They had been found. Miller cursed under his breath. "We have to run now." Jonathan grabbed Olivia's arm, and the three of them sprinted down the hallway. The sound of shouting erupted behind them. Guards, their footsteps pounding like war drums. "Faster!" Jonathan hissed. The emergency exit was just ahead. Miller lunged for the door, slamming his shoulder into it. It burst open, revealing a dimly lit staircase leading downward. "In here," he barked. Jonathan and Olivia rushed inside, just as bullets slammed into the wall behind them. Jonathan turned, slamming the door shut and shoving the metal bar lock into place. "Go!" Miller urged, already bounding down the steps. Jonathan followed, Olivia close behind. The staircase was narrow and spiraled downward, leading into the underground service tunnels beneath the building. The air was thick and damp, the smell of mold and old concrete filling their lungs. They reached the bottom, and Miller hurried ahead, scanning the area. "This way," he pointed. Jonathan wasn't sure how Miller knew this layout so well, but he didn't have time to question it. Gunshots rang out above them, echoing down the stairwell. "They're coming." Olivia gasped. Jonathan grabbed her hand and ran. The tunnels stretched endlessly, dim lights flickering along the walls. Pipes lined the ceilings, dripping with condensation. The air was stifling, thick with the weight of decades-old dust and neglect. Jonathan didn't dare slow down. Miller skidded to a stop at a rusted metal door. He yanked it open, revealing another stairwell leading up. "This leads outside," he panted. "There's an old service lot back here. If we can get to a car, we can get the hell out of here." Jonathan hesitated, eyeing Miller carefully. "Why are you helping us?" Miller's face was pale, but his eyes burned with something different. "Because I don't want to be them anymore." Jonathan held his gaze for a beat, then nodded. No time for trust issues now. They climbed the stairs, each step an eternity. Jonathan's legs burned, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he pushed forward. Finally, they reached the top. Miller shoved open the exit door, and they spilled out into the cool night air. Jonathan sucked in a breath of fresh air, but the relief was short-lived. A row of black SUVs lined the alleyway. Men in suits stood in formation, their expressions blank, their guns raised. Waiting for them. Jonathan skidded to a stop, his heart slamming against his ribs. Olivia let out a sharp breath. "Oh no." Miller paled. "They were waiting for us." Jonathan's mind raced. This wasn't just about corrupt cops anymore. This was something much bigger. The man in the suit from earlier stepped forward, a slow, smug smile spreading across his face. Going somewhere, Mr. Cole. Jonathan clenched his fists, his entire body tensed like a cornered animal. They had fought so hard, and now they were surrounded, trapped. Jonathan's breath came in short, controlled bursts as he took in the scene before him. The alleyway was lined with black SUVs, each one a symbol of the power that had been working against him from the very beginning. The men in suits, calm, disciplined, lethal, stood like statues, their weapons pointed with terrifying precision. And then there was the man in the suit, the one who had orchestrated all of this, the one who had threatened him, imprisoned him, and now, finally, had him right where he wanted him. Going somewhere, Mr. Cole? The man asked again, his voice smooth, amused. Jonathan's mind raced. He had spent years in courtrooms, facing down criminals, exposing their lies. But this wasn't a courtroom. This was a battlefield, and he was standing on the wrong side of the gun. He could feel Olivia tense beside him, her breath unsteady. Miller, who had helped them escape, stood frozen, his body stiff with fear. They were outnumbered, outgunned. But Jonathan wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He squared his shoulders and met the man's gaze. "You really think this ends with me?" he said, his voice unwavering. The man in the suit smirked. "Oh, Mr. Cole, it does end with you. You had your chance to walk away. You didn't take it. And now you pay the price." Jonathan glanced around. There was no way out, no back doors, no escape routes. The only path left was the one in front of him. The man in the suit gave a small nod, and the men around him moved forward, their guns shifting ever so slightly. Jonathan had to think fast. And then a distant sound, a siren, then another, and another. Jonathan's eyes flickered to the entrance of the alleyway, and a slow, cold smile spread across his lips. The cavalry had arrived. Red and blue lights flashed against the dark buildings as squad cars poured into the alley. Dozens of officers emerged, weapons drawn. But these weren't the corrupt ones. These were the good ones, the ones who still believed in justice. The ones Jonathan had called for before he ever set foot in this building. The man in the suit turned, his smug confidence wavering for the first time. Jonathan saw the brief flicker of realization in his eyes, the understanding that he had underestimated him. That Jonathan had known this wasn't just about survival. It was about winning. The police stormed in, surrounding the black SUVs. Shouts filled the air. Men dropped their weapons. The man in the suit took a slow step back, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You think this means you've won?" he asked quietly. Jonathan held his gaze, his hands curling into fists. "I don't think I've won. I know I have." The moment stretched, thick with tension. Then, the man in the suit exhaled, a slight smirk returning to his lips. "This isn't over." Jonathan took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "Yes, it is." The officers surged forward, grabbing the suited men, disarming them, and forcing them against the SUVs. The man in the suit didn't resist, but the smirk never left his face. As he was hauled toward a police vehicle, he called out over his shoulder, "You may have won this battle, Cole, but the war is far from over. You don't fix the system. You just slow it down." Jonathan watched as he was shoved into the back of a police car, the door slamming shut behind him. The system was broken, yes. But tonight, just for a moment, justice had won. Jonathan turned to Olivia, who let out a breath of relief. "That was close," she muttered. He nodded, his mind still racing. "Too close." Miller stood awkwardly beside them, his hands shaking. He swallowed hard. "I didn't think that would actually work." Jonathan turned to him. "You made a choice, Miller. You did the right thing." Miller's face was pale. "Yeah, but what now?" Jonathan glanced at the police vehicles, at the men being dragged away, at the officers still swarming the alley. "This isn't over," he admitted, "but it's a start." He took a deep breath, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders. He had fought for justice his entire life. He had gone up against powerful enemies before. But this was different. He had made enemies tonight that wouldn't forget him. Enemies who weren't bound by the law. But that didn't scare him, because he knew something they didn't. He wasn't just a prosecutor. He was the man who refused to back down. The man who would fight, no matter what came next. And no matter how hard they tried, they would never silence him.